We have keynote speaker, Professor Stephen David, who is Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, where he focuses on international relations with an emphasis on East Asia and the Middle East. Professor David has published 3 books and numerous articles that have appeared in such journals as Foreign Affairs, International Security, and World Politics. He has a master's in East Asian Studies from Stanford University and a PhD from Harvard University. At Hopkins, he has been chair of the Department of Political Science and vice dean for academic affairs.
Well, welcome, everyone. The good news about my talk is you're not going to be tested on it, so you won't have to worry about that. And it's nice to see you all, and I want to thank the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for inviting me, and Henry and Roy for organizing this wonderful setup. What I'm going to be talking about today is a very important question. Will America and China go to war? I mean, it's a critical question. It's maybe one of the most important questions of the 21st century. And in my talk, I'll try and keep it to around 30 minutes. I'm going to talk about why the argument for why indeed is likely, why it's likely that America and China will go to war, why it's not likely America and China will go to war, why I used to believe on the optimistic side that we won't have war, but now with the advent of the Trump administration, not so sure. So let me begin for why war is likely. And I'm going to first talk a bit about international relations theory. I'm going to focus on theory that looks at countries like billiard balls, where you don't have to understand what's inside the country. You don't need to know its domestic politics, its history, its culture. You just have to know how much power it has. And you could predict how these countries behave in the same way you would predict how billiard balls will move when they're hit on a billiard table. And there are a number of theories in international relations which suggest that war indeed is likely, if not inevitable. One of those theories is offensive realism. Now, what is offensive realism? Offensive realism argues that countries, especially great powers, most of all want to be secure. They want to make sure they can continue to survive. And in order to do that, they feel they have to be the biggest, strongest, toughest country in their region. If they are more powerful by far than anyone else, no one's going to mess with them. To do that, they've got to gobble up other countries, expand as much as they can. Now, if China follows this policy, especially in Asia, the argument is it can't help but have to confront the United States, because America has a lot of interest in Asia. We've got allies, we've got Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. We're concerned about international waterways like the South China Sea. So if China just expands as this theory predicts it will, a confrontation with America is inevitable. Another international relations theory that suggests the inevitability, or at least likelihood of war, is called the Thucydides trap, popularized by Graham Allison at Harvard. Now, does anyone know who Thucydides is? Thucydides is an author who wrote 2,500 years ago a classic on the Peloponnesian War. I teach a class on the Peloponnesian War at Hopkins. I think some of my students think I was in the Peloponnesian War. I'm not that old yet. In the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides argued the war between Athens and Sparta was inevitable because rising powers inevitably go to war with existing great powers. And analysts have taken this theory of rising powers and existing great powers and applied it to America and China. The argument here is that China is a rising power, America is the existing power, and therefore conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. And you think historically, think of a rising Germany before World War II going to war in Europe. Think of a rising Japan going to war with the United States in World War II. The argument here is that a rising China will inevitably conflict with America that wants to maintain the status quo. And again, you don't have to know anything about the internal dynamics of the country. Rising powers, existing powers, war is inevitable. Third theory that argues that war is inevitable says that countries that develop internally, domestically, will want to expand their interests externally. That if your economy starts growing, if your military starts growing inside your country, you're going to want to expand more outside your country. And again, Germany and Japan are perfect examples of this. In the 1930s, Germany and Japan, their economies exploded, their militaries got larger, and so too were their aims in the international system. There is no question that China is exploding internally. In the 1970s, it had about 1% of the world's gross development product. Now it's about 20%. China has the world's largest army, the world's largest navy. It's building up its nuclear weapons. It's the leader in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence. It has TikTok. What further sign of development could you ask of a country? So here the view is that because China is developing so much within its country, it's going to want to see its interests expand externally, which again is going to lead to a confrontation with America that has interests throughout the world, including in Asia. And a fourth theory, in some ways, goes against this notion of exploding internally. But the fourth theory argues that, in fact, China is going to decline in future years, and it recognized this, that we have what is called peak China, that China sees itself as at the epitome of its strength. Now, why should this bring about war? Well, the argument here is that if China has interests, such as grabbing Taiwan, it recognizes that if it's going to do it, it's got to do it now. Because 5 years from now, it's going to be in a much weaker position. And there are a lot of reasons to think that China may be in decline. Demographically, its population is declining. China used to be the most populous country in the world, no more. India has taken its place. China for years had a one-child policy, with the result is that China has gotten old, and there are very few young people to support people like myself and many of the people in the council in their old age. One statistic that really resonates is that in China, the sale of adult diapers is bigger than the sale of infant diapers. So this is a country that's in trouble. And plus, there are problems with the economy, there are problems with the environment. So the sense is that China's best years are behind it. And if it's going to grab the things it wants, if it's going to achieve its aims, it's got to do so now. If you open up now the billiard ball and look inside China more, the case for war gets even stronger. So now we're opening up this billiard ball. And what do we see? Well, we see an America and China with very different ideological systems. America is a democratic, it used to be, a capitalist system. China is a dictatorial communist system where the government controls the economy and just about everything else within the state. The United States believes in individual liberties, such as we have in the Bill of Rights, the right of freedom of speech, an independent court system, the right to gather and protest. China has none of those individual rights. And here the belief is that countries who see the world differently, who have very different ideological systems, are more likely to clash. I mean, if America and Britain were the two greatest powers, there'd still be issues, but probably not as much of the issues as we have with China. Moreover, again, looking inside this billiard ball, China is infused with nationalism, the belief that they are better, they are distinct and better than everyone else. And along with nationalism is a sense of national rejuvenation. Xi Jinping especially emphasizes that China for years has been bullied and exploited by the Western powers in Japan. But now China is strong. It's not going to take it anymore. During the ages of colonialism, there were reports that in parks in Shanghai, a Chinese city, there'd be signs saying, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." And they're not going to suffer this humiliation anymore. They want to take their rightful place in the sun as the greatest world power, and the only country standing in its way is America. So again, a movement towards war. Within the United States, there is also problems. There's tremendous hostility to China. In the American Congress, they can't agree on anything. They can't agree on what to rename a post office. But what they can agree is that China is our #1 adversary. China is our enemy. And if you look at public opinion polls, huge majorities of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, are all in agreement that our chief adversary is China. Making the push toward war even greater are a number of flashpoints, areas where conflict could emerge. The South China Sea is this huge waterway which much of the world's trade goes through. America sees this as an international waterway where the rights of transit have to be guaranteed. For China, however, it belongs to it. It's a Chinese lake. And ships going through that have to answer to China, have to get China's permission. So again, a major area where confrontation can occur, especially since you've got American ships, American planes, Chinese planes, very close to one another, raising the possibility of an accidental collision. Another area of conflict, which we're all especially cognizant of now, is trade. President Trump now has put 54% tariffs on China. China is a tremendous exporting country, the largest by far in the world. It depends on exporting its products. All of a sudden now, its products are going to get much, much more expensive, which is going to create problems not only with the American economy, but with the Chinese economy. So issues of trade, the belief that the Chinese are not altogether fair in the way they conduct trade, is going to continue to exacerbate tensions between the two countries. There are issues of human rights. The United States for a long time has been upset that the Chinese government does not give basic liberties and freedoms to its people, that it imprisons dissidents, something that the United States does not like. And most importantly, of course, is Taiwan. Taiwan is an island about 90 miles from China. The United States sees it as an example of a prosperous democratic state where people enjoy freedom and liberties and want to be free of Chinese control. China sees Taiwan as belonging to China, as a renegade province that rightfully belongs in the People's Republic. And many argue that Xi Jinping feels that his legacy, his place in history, will not be achieved until he completes the national rejuvenation by rejoining Taiwan with the People's Republic. But again, standing in his way is the American military. And if Xi Jinping invades, and if the United States comes to Taiwan's defense, as we have often said we will do, then we've got war. So I hope everyone is sufficiently depressed. There's a lot saying that war's around the corner. But let me now give the case for why war is not likely. First, the international relations theories that say war is likely and inevitable are challenged by many. It's not clear that they're all that accurate. Yeah, let's take offensive realism, the notion that countries are going to grab as much as they can in order to be secure. Well, it may well be that if you are the biggest, toughest, strongest country in your region, then you are safe. But the quest to get to that position is filled with risk and dangers and is going to reduce your security. As China expands, and if it expands in an unbridled way, other countries are going to push back. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. They're going to push back against China. They're going to perhaps align more closely with the United States, making Chinese security less rather than more secure. I mean, think of Nazi Germany. They were offensive realists. They grabbed almost all of Europe. But at the end of the day, did they enhance Germany's security? No. At the end of World War II, Germany, Japan, in a similar way, was smoking ruins. So yeah, being strong and tough, maybe if you get there, you are very secure, but the path to getting there is going to make your country less rather than more secure. And the belief is that the Chinese leadership recognizes this and will constrain themselves, will not seek to expand as much as they can, and recognize that they don't want to push countries into hostility. What about the Thucydides trap, that countries, rising countries are always going to go to war with existing great powers? Well, a lot of the examples of this come from long ago history, 1500s, 1600s. In an age of nuclear weapons, for example, it's not altogether clear that that's the case. A rising Soviet Union, for example, did not go to war with the United States. What about the notion that if you become stronger internally, you're going to become more aggressive externally? Well, sometimes it's true, but not all the times. Japan and Germany after World War II became economic powerhouses, and yet their foreign policy has been very moderate, very peace-loving, very benign. Countries may decide, and China may decide this too, to put their economic strength not in external expansion, but in developing themselves domestically. And what about the notion that, well, if you're in decline, you're going to seize the moment and go to war? Again, not at all clear that's true. First of all, we're not even sure that China is in decline or that China sees itself in decline. Many Chinese argue that, yes, they have fewer young people, but that technology like AI will compensate for that. Moreover, even if you do go into decline, it doesn't mean you're going to be more aggressive. Britain, after World War II, became much less of a great power, went into decline economically, politically, but it didn't reach out and try and be more aggressive. Moreover, there are whole bunches of theories in international relations which argue that China really and America will seek peace. One is called defensive realism, and defensive realism is sort of the counterpoint to offensive realism. In defensive realism, countries and leaders recognize that to be too aggressive is simply going to provoke opposition against you, making you less secure. Therefore, you're going to, on your own, pursue much more moderate policies rather than push countries to turn against you. And there are a whole set of theories we call liberal theories, which have in common the recognition that countries realize they have much more to gain by cooperation than through conflict. It is much better to deal with countries in a respectful way than to simply try and go to war with them to get what you want. And there are other factors leading to peace, especially regarding the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. One is that it's hard to realize this, but in some ways we are in a very peaceful time. There has been a decline, a marked decline in countries conquering other countries and seeking to exploit their resources and wealth. Charles Tilly, a very prominent political sociologist, notes that Europe in the year 1500 had about 500 different countries and statelets scattered throughout Europe. By 1900, it had 20. So what happened to all the others? They were conquered, they were absorbed. The big took over the weak. That hardly happens anymore. It's not over, but it hardly happens anymore. I mean, the only country I can think of since the end of World War II that was removed from the world's maps by conquest, by military conquest, was South Vietnam in 1975. This is remarkable that so few countries have become the victim of armed conquest when it was such a common practice in past years. Now, why is this the case? Well, that's the subject of another lecture, but let me just mention a few arguments why. One is norms, broad guidelines that most countries follow. Norms argue that it is impermissible for a country to invade another country. It doesn't mean every country follows these norms, as we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine. but most do most of the time. There's also nationalism. It's harder to conquer a country and get what you want from it if the people in that country are energized to oppose your conquest. Just think of the problems America has had in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And most important are two factors which make conquest less likely and that are very relevant to the Sino-American relationship. One is globalization, interdependence. The United States and China, their economies are intertwined and depend on each other. We, the United States, spends about $600 billion a year in trade with China. It's one of our most important trading partners. China also depends on the American economy as a major export market. Now, maybe that's changing, but while it exists, you know that if we go to war with China, if China goes to war with us, the economies are going to collapse. That's just an important constraint on going to war. And even more important is nuclear weapons. Both America and China have nuclear weapons. Both of them have to recognize that if they go to war with each other, it is suicidal. It is impossible to fight and win a nuclear war. And the recognition of that is an important constraint on going to war, even conventional war, which could escalate to the nuclear level. It's very different from the situation just prior to World War I. Just prior to World War I, Germany, Britain, France, Russia, they rushed into war thinking the war was going to be over in a few months, not that many casualties, because virtually all the wars in Europe in the past 100 years before World War I were wars like that. The Franco-Prussian War, the Austro-French War. These wars were over quite quickly with relatively little casualties. What nuclear weapons give you is a crystal ball. You could look into that crystal ball and know, my gosh, if we go to war, it is going to be the end of us and maybe the end of the world. That's a crystal ball that the leaders before World War I did not have, but that we do have. And it's hoping that if both American leaders and Chinese leaders recognize that war would be suicidal, that they would not embark on one. One other theory that I had introduced a number of years ago is omnibalancing. And in omnibalancing, the view is that countries don't go to war or pursue policies in the national interest, but rather pursue wars or pursue policies in the personal interest of the leaders involved. That don't ask so much what is in America's interest, what is in China's interest, you ask what is in Trump's interest, what is in Xi Jinping's interest. And the interest of leaders, the most important interest, is to stay in power. Because if you lose power, you lose access to the good life, and in some countries, you lose your freedom or even your life. So you're going to pursue policies that don't endanger your hold on power. In this view, I used to believe that Xi Jinping will calculate going to war with Taiwan isn't worth the risks. There were too many uncertainties involved. Taiwan's 90 miles away, just a few beaches. As Russia found with Ukraine, things can go wrong, and a botched invasion could easily lead to his removal from power by the military, by the Chinese Communist Party, or by others. Xi Jinping can forever keep the reunification of Taiwan as a future goal and remain in power until he lives a long life. But if he goes to war and loses, he's finished. So again, I held the view that, well, given those risks, Xi will decide in the end not to attack Taiwan. Now I'm not so sure. As the Trump administration has taken power and developed this policy of America first, which in many respects is America only, things are different. And we've seen this in Ukraine. America recently voted in the United Nations against condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That Oval Office meeting where Trump and Vance humiliated Zelensky suggests that maybe America is not going to back Ukraine in its war against Russia. And this marks a departure in American foreign policy. I grew up in a world where the United States supported democratic allies against threats from dictatorships. And Taiwan is relevant here. It is now increasingly doubtful whether America would go to war to protect Taiwan if China invades. And this may convince Xi Jinping he can get away with it. With the chances of success now very high, the less chance of a botched invasion bringing him down, Xi may decide that the risks are worth it. Once such an invasion occurs, however, America may get drawn into the war. And so you have a situation where the Trump administration has turned a situation where war with China is not likely into one which war could very well occur. And this reminds me, at the heart of conservatism is the fear of unintended consequences. The Trump administration's isolationism and love affair with autocrats may yet produce a war with China he has so much tried to avoid. Thank you very much. I'm happy now to take any questions.
Thank you very much for such a timely speech. Very much. Questions from the audience? Yes.
If a war breaks out, do you think it'll be conventional, or would it develop into nuclear weapons? How do you see a war evolving between the two countries?
Well, I think the war would initially be conventional, but if one side is losing, especially if the Chinese side, say, is losing, they may resort to nuclear weapons to prevent their defeat. And there is a belief among some that nuclear war can be kept limited. It's conceivable, it's possible, but it's also likely that it would not be limited. And once nuclear weapons start flying, which, and remember, nuclear weapons have not been used since the end of World War II, and that's when America dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, a country that did not have its own nuclear weapons to deter us. Once the nuclear weapons start flying, it is hard to imagine how and where they're going to stop. And nuclear war can not only be the end of those two countries, America and China, but because of nuclear winter and other factors, it could be the end of life on Earth. You know how, like, your mom used to say, well, it's not the end of the world. This is the end of the world. Yes?
How do you think China's and America's allies would react to a possible war in Taiwan?
It's a good question. It's how would America's allies, and perhaps China's allies, react to a war with Taiwan? My sense is, especially if it looks like it's going to get nuclear, a lot of the allies are just going to keep their heads down. They don't want to be seen as possible targets of a nuclear attack should the war proceed. The hope is that that won't happen. And we'll never get to that stage. But, you know, since we're talking about nuclear weapons, one thing you have to ask yourself, what should Taiwan do? I mean, Taiwan is threatened by a major power that it cannot compete with conventionally. China just has so much more of a population, so much of a bigger GDP. So it can't match China ship by ship, tank by tank. So if it wants to resist China, what can it do? Well, one thing it can do is rely on allies, mainly the United States. That's what it's done throughout its whole history. And as long as it believes that America's support was forthcoming, that strategy makes sense. But what if you're Taiwan and you believe that America may not come to your aid? And again, the Trump administration is very unclear, very unreliable about whether it will come to protect Taiwan. What do you do? Well, then you got two choices. One, you can try and protect yourself. The only way to do that, however, is to go nuclear, which has all other kinds of implications. And the other is to give in to China, to appease. And neither option is very attractive, but if you're Taiwan, you've got to be thinking along those lines. Again, if you can't defeat China with conventional force and you can't rely on America, developing your own nuclear weapons may be your only option. And this is not just Taiwan. throughout Europe, countries like Poland, Germany, had not really considered developing nuclear weapons, are now thinking about it very seriously. So it's a scary, scary world you guys are growing up in. Well, let me get someone from another school here. Oh, yes, College Park.
I understand that the relationship that America has with its allies is changing due to the current administration.
Yes.
How will that affect if, I guess, with the reaction of other countries, if the U.S. and China were to go to war?
Well, America's advantage over China, one of America's traditional advantages over China, is that America has had lots of friends. We have the European powers, the NATO powers in Asia. We have Japan and South Korea, Taiwan itself, India. Who are China's friends? I mean, kind of Russia, although there are ruptures in that alliance. North Korea, Iran. I mean, not countries you really want to hang around with. It may well be, again, as this new administration takes power and pursues an isolationist path, that America will not have as many friends as it did in the past. Maybe we won't have any friends. That puts us much more on a level playing field with China. Even more alarmingly, it may be that countries will increasingly look to China for support. Say, well, America is no longer reliable. America is not here for us. Who's the other great power? And China is the number one trading power of most of the world countries in the world. If you want economic development, economic support, economic trade, increasingly they may look to China. And again, for those of my generation who've benefited from 80 years of largely peace and prosperity, we're talking about a very different world, a world that is shaped by an autocratic, communist dictatorship, rather than a liberal democratic country. And that's frightening. That's frightening. Yes?
You kind of touched on Russia's relationship with China. How do you think Russia would react in the event of a war between China and America?
It's a good question. What would Russia do? Again, I think Russia would give a lot of verbal support, maybe transfer even some weaponry. But as soon as nuclear weapons start flying, I think most countries, if they can, want to stay out of the conflict. The Russians don't want to be party to a conflict. They don't want to be target of a conflict. I will say, and this is another lecture, nuclear deterrence has become much, much more difficult for the United States in this new world, where China and Russia are both seen as prime adversaries. During the good old days of the Cold War, America simply had to deter the Russians, and the Russians with us. I guess then it would be the Soviets. And deterrence is simply persuading someone not to do something by threatening them with unacceptable consequences if they do it. But we had our eyes on the Soviets. They had our eyes on us. It was a basically simple affair. But now America has to deter both China and Russia. Much more difficult. I mean, if China and Russia each have, say, 1,000 nuclear weapons, does America need 2,000? And if America builds 2,000, well, the Russians are going to say, well, we need 2,000. The Chinese will say that as well. And you have a burgeoning arms race. Astrophysicists tell us that if you have two celestial bodies out in space, you can exactly predict how the gravitational pull is going to determine their trajectories. If you put a third one there, they can't predict anything. And now we're in a three-body problem, which is going to create lots and lots of problems. Yes?
Given the competition in technological advancements with the two countries, how do you believe that would play a factor or role in the uproar of conflict?
Yeah, technology is now key. I mean, it used to be like maybe numbers of weapons or even natural resources, but now it's things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and there is a huge race for this. Now, I'm sort of biased being in a research university, but America has developed the edge in many of these technologies precisely because research in universities have been so productive and so creative in their work. But we are now in the point of destroying these universities, at least weakening them tremendously. A lot of the great talent in the world may migrate to China, or at least will not come to the United States. And the indigenous talent we have here may decide to pursue other paths. So, I mean, I don't think Trump is a Chinese agent, but if he was, this is exactly the way I think he would be behaving. Yes. Do I think it's more or less likely? I mean, to me, I still think that the constraining effects of nuclear weapons and the recognition of the economic disaster that war would produce would be enough of a restraint to prevent us from going to war. But it's like 60-40. It's very close. And remember, war can happen almost accidentally. Let's say an American ship and a Chinese ship in the South China Sea, ram into each other because they're already getting very close to one another. And the individual commanders start shooting and it escalates, and who knows where it will end. So the prospects to me of war, even nuclear war, are far greater today with your generation than they ever were during the Cold War in my generation. I mean, we faced an autocratic, Marxist-Leninist Soviet Union, but you had rational leaders on both sides of the equation in a relatively simple relationship. Now it's become much more complicated, and if because American support has become much less assured, many more countries develop nuclear weapons, the prospect of someone, somewhere, somehow launching a nuclear weapon becomes much, much greater. And that's really very frightening. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I asked you. A bell's ringing. What is it?
No, we got a few more minutes.
Few more, and Henry's the boss.
Well, I know you want to push that bell.
Okay. All right. Well, let me. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. You asked some. You haven't asked something. Let me talk to people who haven't asked a question first. Okay, you'll be next.
How do you see the likelihood of war changing had Trump not won the most recent election?
Well, again, it's hard to do what are called counterfactuals. I think if Kamala Harris had won, the world would look pretty much the way it had been, which is far from a perfect world, but not quite the chaos we're seeing now. Under the Biden-Harris administration, Biden himself on 4 separate occasions said, if Taiwan was invaded by China, America would come to its aid. And I think that was an important deterrent impact on the Chinese. Now Trump is yelling that Taiwan is stealing our profits and in computer chips, and they're not grateful enough, and maybe he'll get up, with a headache in the morning, and who knows what will happen. So I think the prospects for war in a Harris administration would have been far less than we have now. Yes. How will internal conflicts in the U.S. and China affect what? A possibility of war. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. China does not have much in the way of domestic conflicts in that it has suppressed people like the Uyghurs and in Tibet and elsewhere. What concerns me is the United States. I mean, I think at the end of the day, America's biggest enemy is not Russia, it's not China, it's not Iran, it's America. I've never seen this country, and I grew up at the time of the Vietnam War, I've never seen this country so divided and so polarized. Scholars of civil war say that when countries devolve into different factions, and when you believe your enemy with the other faction presents an existential threat to you, and when you move from a democracy to a less free environment, those are all the ingredients for civil war. Now, I'm not predicting civil war in America. I don't think it would happen. but it's not inconceivable. In my class at Johns Hopkins, and something I thought I never would have, we have a whole session on the prospects of civil war erupting in the United States. And that's something I would have thought was inconceivable. It used to be, they would do public opinion polls and they'd say, how would you feel if your daughter or grandchildren married someone of a different race, in the 1960s? And overwhelmingly people said, I can't accept that. I wouldn't want that. And they'd ask, how would you feel if your daughter or grandchildren married someone of a different political party? And people said, I don't care, Democrat, Republican, who cares? That's flipped. Now people, thankfully, are much more open to having their children in an interracial relationship. But what they don't want, what they fear, and what they would resent is if their daughter or son married someone of the different political party. And that's where America has come. Democrats and Republicans each see themselves as threats to their very existence, not as people to argue about different regulations, different taxes, but people who are striking at the very heart, of the very essence of America. And that's not a healthy situation, and it can't be long sustained, and I think it's being made worse today.
One more.
Okay,
one last
over there
question.
in the back, sorry. Role of public opinion. China, it's easy to dismiss public opinion in China, but not totally. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party leadership knows they need to have the support of the people in a general sense. What worries me is that what you now have in China is this hyper-nationalism. The Chinese regime cannot legitimate itself. It cannot convince people that it is a rightful authority simply on the basis of ideology. I mean, no one believes in Marxist ideology anymore. When I say no one, I mean, people at Johns Hopkins, my colleagues do. But aside from American academia, Marxists are gone. So how do you convince people you're the rightful authority in China? Well, one is to provide for economic benefits, a better life, but the Chinese economy is getting a little shaky. Another way is through ultranationalism. Say, we're the ones who are bringing China back. We're making China great again. But if the people are ultranationalist, it might be hard to constrain their enthusiasm, including for war. And you may get dragged into a war, even if that's not what you intended. And to a certain extent, the same thing could be true in the United States.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.